Welcome to the 2023 third ICRRA conference towards more sustainable development, multilateral organizations and cultural relations in the 2030 agenda and beyond. We're delighted to have with you with us, and for this session, especially Professor Raj Isar for the keynote talk on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, putting culture back in its place. This is one of a number of online sessions taking place as a part of the conference. Hopefully you could have been with us for the first keynote, but there will several be ones to follow, and they're all also available afterwards on YouTube. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Odila Triebel, and I'm from IFA, the Institute for Cultural Relations, and I'm a member of the ICRRA network. ICRRA stands for the International Cultural Relations Research Alliance and was initiated by IFA and the British Council 5 years ago. So before I introduce our speaker, let me say a little bit about ICRRA and our overall aims of this conference. The ICRRA network brings together global research and insight on the theory and practice of cultural relations. When we talk about cultural relations, we are really talking about ways of working internationally in the areas of arts, education, and civil society to build trust and understanding, to promote collaboration, and to enhance and sustain dialogue between peoples and cultures. So with this conference, we are aiming to put our network's knowledge about cultural relations into a dialogue with experts on multilateralism and sustainable development. We are doing this in the context of the UN Agenda 2030 and the UN Summit of the Future's call for more effective multilateralism. And we are hoping that our talks and discussions over the course of the conference will help us to better understand how cultural relations can support multilateral and regional organizations to deliver sustainable development. We are glad to have you on board to be part of this discussion. Please do post your questions, comments, and reflections in the Q&A box in the chat as we go along, and we'll aim to cover as many of these as we can at the end of the session. So on today's session, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Raj Isar. Professor Isar straddles different domains of cultural theory and practice, notably cultural policy across the world. Since January 2017, he has been Education Director of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and Isar joined the American University of Paris in 2002 and was Jean Monnet Professor from 2003 and 2008. He asked me to be very sure on his bio, and for many of us, he's very well known, and we are very glad to have him here. And because we started late, I leave it to Nit, but not out of respect, but because I assume that many of us do know you, and I'm very glad that you are here. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you. Can you see me? Yes, okay, great. So now I'm full screen. You can all see me. Is that good? Yes, yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Odila. I'm really very flattered and honored to have been invited, mainly because I've been for quite a while out of the swim of things with respect to how the cultural agenda is being advanced across the UN system and other multilateral organizations. But as I've remained somewhat connected to the international cultural relations scene, it has struck me as I was preparing for this that very little has changed over the past decade. You might even say over the past 20 years, 2 decades. And that many of my earlier concerns and ideas are topical. They remain topical today. At the outset, however, I have to admit that I was initially a bit puzzled that ICRRA, whose purpose is, as you've already described it, to build bridges between practical cultural work, scholarly reflection, and policy advice, unquote, had organized a conference with such a convoluted title. And I thought that perhaps indicated a certain amount of fuzzy thinking. But that first impression was dispelled completely as soon as I saw the program of panel discussions. And I imagine that these panels will generate ideas and action points that will be truly grounded and fit for purpose. And I look forward to being able to follow as many of them as I can. Now, what I'm going to do this afternoon is share a few sets of thoughts with you, some of them critical, some of them provocative. And I hope that the provocation will turn out to be useful. Some of what I have to say will be also a bit tangential to the core topic of multilateralism. And I do hope that these tangential points will appear constructive and useful as well. So I'm going to try and cover 4 domains this morning. The first is, or this afternoon, the first is to do a little bit of what I would call semantic hygiene around the notion of sustainable development itself. So this is a critical introduction to what we're talking about. Then I'm going to briefly explore the interface between the arts, artistic practice and heritage, and environmental sustainability. And so that's a more constructive contribution. But then what I'm going to do after that is share a few thoughts, and that's the tangential part, a few thoughts on an international research agenda on cultural policy issues in general that I think we need. And it's been decades that I thought that we needed this, and it hasn't happened yet. And then I'll conclude with some suggestions that focus on how non-state actors can advance not just cooperation, but research concerning cultural relations. And that's because the non-state civil society actors are really the drivers of international cultural relations. And I'm very glad that Alexandra Xantaki, this morning in her wonderful presentation, mine is going to be very pale in comparison, but Xantaki really looked at the ways in which the international sustainable development goals debate is taking place. And that's not something that I would have been able to do. So there are some elements that I could pick up, but she's really prepared the field very, very carefully and very well. So on my first point with regard to sustainable development, we know that the original term, as it was coined in 1987 by the Brundtland Commission, had a clear ecological focus. It concerned climate change, it concerned environmental degradation. But there is a problem in that since then, the notion has been greatly stretched beyond this original meaning. And it's come to embrace practically every aspect of the human condition. And in the process, the term has become what Claude Lévi-Strauss used to call a floating signifier. It has become very large. It's become a very large and very vague, constantly expanding concatenation of ideas. And so several questions do arise in connection with this. How useful, how really useful is such a hugely expansive definition of sustainability? How useful is it as a policy horizon? If it can mean so many different things, what is the specific cultural policy challenge that is being invoked? And the other issue is that if one believes, and this is my case, that the original idea of sustainability is really the most powerful one, then what purchase can actually existing cultural policy, which is really arts and heritage policy, what purchase can that have on the values, the mental maps that create unsustainability? So there's a problem, there's unsustainability, and how can cultural policy address that? Well, that's rather difficult to do when you look at what departments and ministries of culture are actually all about, because it's essentially anthropological. Development is also problematical, but a bit less. And we know that development means transformative change, positive change. But it's also clear that it was clear by the early 1960s that the term itself, the idea itself of development was unsatisfactory. It didn't really work when it was used on its own. And so you had all of these qualifiers: integrated development, endogenous development, human development, which is a very powerful concept of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And of all these qualifiers, the one that's lasted the most, the longest, is sustainable development. And as I say this, I just think we should be mindful of what Wolfgang Sachs, the environmental scholar, how he characterized the notion of development. And I quote, "A perception which models reality, a myth which comforts societies, and a fantasy which unleashes passions." And as Sachs also observed, perceptions, myths, and fantasies operate quite independently from empirical facts or rational conclusions. And the pairing of culture and development is ambiguous as well. Is it cultural development? Is it development for culture? Is it culture for development? Or is it culture in development? Are we talking about cultural development as the flourishing of the arts and culture sector, which is the way that it's used in France? Has long been used that way and still used that way. Or are we talking about the flourishing of ways of life as a whole? And so in that case, just an example, given that the country of Bhutan uses the notion of gross national happiness instead of gross national product, should we think that Bhutan's state policy is actually the ultimate degree of advancement in envisioning cultural development? Or should we return to the cultural dimension of development usages that were propagated by UNESCO in the 1980s, but which proved rather difficult to pin down and act upon? And I was struck this morning that Alexander Zangtaki actually used that notion, cultural dimension of development. Or are we talking about development itself as a cultural project, that the whole thing of development is cultural? And would we say, in line with Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, that culture is constitutive and foundational for development, rather than just a means, an instrument towards it? Do we mean to see that culture is seen as the bedrock of ideas and values on which a society dreams its dreams and charts its aspirations? Is this the basis upon which that society's model of development is envisioned or defined? Well, that's very, very far from where we are today. And I'm not sure how much more or how much more progress he can actually make. But let's return to the term sustainable itself, with which I have long had problems. It's become a politically correct qualifier, and it's often used unthinkingly. It's often used in a ritual way. And you could say the same thing about the way in which the term is used, not just in culture, but in other fields, in economics, in terms of social processes, political processes. So does sustainability mean the maintenance, the maintainability, if you like, of a broad societal process? Or are we referring to whether a project or a program can actually last? Can it live for a long time? Are we talking about the financial viability of a project or an institution? Or whether, or to the ways in which certain practices may be conducive to a better quality of life? Now, all of these usages are valid. All of these understandings have their usefulness, provided we say something specific and definable when we use the term in each of these different ways. And we're not always doing that. And I was struck a couple of years ago to find in my sort of literature search the lamentations of an architect And I'm giving you here a quote that's a little long. And so this architect lamented, "The very word, emptied of meaning through overuse, increasingly dominates architectural design and discourse." And this I didn't know. This was a discovery, that it's gone even there. So this word that increasingly dominates architectural design and discourse, and he says, "and frankly, it drives me crazy. People use it all the time without really knowing what they're talking about. I always ask, sustainable of what? Too often, the word becomes appropriated as a band-aid, cure-all additive that can be applied as environmental, ecological veneer to an architectural project, like icing on a cake. But the word has become such an all-encompassing buzzword, a signifier onto which so many different aspirations and agendas have been projected, that it doesn't really mean anything anymore." And I'll just continue by saying that even the United Nations says the same thing. It's to 2020 Sustainable Development, from Brundtland to Rio 2012, that's the document that I'm citing, says this: "The nearly universal adoption of sustainable development as a guiding principle is in part due to its flexibility. It allows various stakeholders to adapt the concept to their own purposes. This strength, however, is also its liability, because various interpretations have led to confusion and compromised implementation. Indeed, dozens of, unquote, after compromised implementation. Indeed, dozens of alternative definitions have been proposed, sorry. Now, I think we all know how the idea of culture as the fourth pillar of sustainable development emerged from the work of John Hawkes in Australia and inspired the UCLG's Agenda 21 for Culture. And this Agenda 21 is cast entirely in the mold of the wider sustainable development discourse. Hence, it necessarily encompasses a huge range of topics. It's been vigorously promoted by the UCLG, Agenda 21 for Culture. It's had adaptations and improvements since the work began in 2004. Yet, what has happened is that its breadth of coverage has become even wider. There's a staggering range of commitments that this particular agenda covers. And I think we all know what those are: cultural rights, heritage, diversity, you name it, a whole bunch of things. And in each case, what we see that the challenges are set out by UCLG and measures are envisaged that are all very lucid, but they're also all very broad. And this is precisely the problem, because it makes Agenda 21 for Culture a kind of blueprint for tackling the entire gamut of challenges in the contemporary human condition. In the 2015 Bilbao document of UCLG, the domain that I think we should be focusing on, which is the natural environment, the interactions between cultural factors and the natural environment are addressed very well, but only in a single chapter that's entitled, appropriately, Cultural Factors as Accelerators of Environmental Responsibility. So programs so vast as this are highly elusive for analytical purposes. And I think having analytical rigor is not important just for a university professor or a school teacher. It's also important, if we are activists and militants in a cause, to be very clear about what exactly our cause is. Such vast programs also pose the problem that they include too much, and they are too diverse, too diffuse, either to separate analytically what we might call the twisted threads of human experience, or to interpret the designs into which these threads are all the time being woven. Let me just take a little glass of water here, because I tend to get a dry mouth when we speak. when I speak, sorry. But despite what I'm saying, since the UCLG is a network of cities, we do see that a number of municipalities belonging to the UCLG have certainly begun to put in place cross-cutting local policies and mechanisms to implement the Agenda 21 for culture. But it's extremely hard to find any national level frameworks of this kind. And that's also a level about which we should be concerned. I've scanned recently the websites of ministries of cultures across the world, and there is no sustainable development component in the cultural policy of any developing country, for example. And there are some in the developed countries, but they're very rare. There have been a number of very useful academic responses to sustainability as a cultural policy issue. And the most useful one that I have come across is David Throsby's concept of culturally sustainable development. I can go into that a bit later if you like, but I won't right now. But what we see is that instead of focused, workable, actionable definitions and scopes such as these, such as the one that David Throsby has talked about, there is no clearly defined path. And a very appropriate and polemical challenge was addressed to our sector several years ago by a literary critic whose name is Terry Eagleton. And he actually was critiquing the way in which we reify and objectify culture as a determining force that's endowed with explanatory power and that exerts an impact on everything. And what I'm going to do, since the point that was raised by Eagleton is a bit complex, so I'm going to just share that with you and just give you a minute to digest what you see on the screen here, and which I personally think is absolutely true. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And have I stopped sharing properly? Yeah, I think so. Right, that's good. So there's that idea of putting culture back in its place, and that doesn't mean downplaying it, but it does require us to define that significance in terms that are at once more realistic and at the same time more ambitious. And I think the answer to this challenge lies in what the anthropologist John Clammer asked us to do by narrowing the focus to cover, and I quote, the probable social and cultural consequences of significant shifts in climatic patterns as a result of global warming on different human populations, including the immense social suffering likely to result, and the cultural factors that have contributed to the ecological crisis in the first place. In other words, the myriad attitudes, behaviors, and practices that together generate unsustainable development, together with the many cultural activities that are in reality ecologically dangerous or disruptive. So in this case, given the main axes of concern, the cultural in question must surely be the broad anthropological concept that, as I said at the outset, actually existing cultural policy cannot address. But who would ever deny that the work of artists and the arts can powerfully illuminate the challenges? Artists can help to transform hearts and minds by envisioning alternative futures and bringing about a you might say, a re-enchantment, the opposite of Max Weber's Entzauberung, bringing back an enchantment somewhere. And we can imagine all kinds of analogous practices that could be introduced by cultural institutions, by theaters, by museums, which are all consuming non-renewable resources. How can they systematically organize themselves, these institutions of our sector, to reduce their carbon footprint, plan their buildings and operations in ways that consume less non-renewable energy, or ensure that their modes of operation contribute as minimally as possible to environmental pollution. So there's a challenge there. There's a whole set of challenges linked to international tourism and to the fact that the degree of international tourism, which during COVID, of course, decreased, is going to be renewed again. And so it's because these non-renewable energy consumptions are getting so large, it's because this possibility is so real that the position of museums, let's say, as keepers of the past and the collective memory will become more important than ever as societies are forced to change and environments get transformed. So I'm going to transit now into another section of what I shared with you. And that's the idea that we really do need a much better research and agenda, a much better international comparative cooperative research agenda in our field. Cross-cultural research really has to be a priority in our interconnected world. And although some work has been done in areas such as cultural participation or consumption, governments in some countries have done a lot of work, but the findings of this work don't really inform the linkages between cultural policy and development as a process. There are not enough indicators, there's a lack of conceptual clarity, and if we don't have that conceptual clarity, we're not going to be able, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to really muster the arguments that are needed to push the cultural dimension to center stage on the global agenda. So there are a number of priority issues. Access to cultural resources. Who and how many are excluded from the international circulation of cultural goods? What is the extent of cultural diversity in production and distribution? Who has or does not have access to the technologies of cultural production and distribution? What are the still remaining gender imbalances in relation to cultural resources that really do need to be addressed? So that's an area that traditional cultural policy just doesn't get into enough. It's a lacuna, which I think is serious and that needs to be filled. Citizenship and public culture, that's another theme. How are publicly funded cultural institutions governed and administered? What is the impact of regulatory and fiscal action by governments? What is the role of civil society bodies in promoting civic involvement? And then we come to, in connection with this last set of issues, the legal cultural interfaces. The national and international legal regimes that can convert cultural products into cultural properties, the moral rights of creators as individuals. This morning, Alexander Zantaki referred to the work of WIPO as an important dimension. They were doing it without knowing it, as she said. Ways of extending these rights of creators to entire communities, to indigenous peoples in particular. Mediating between different systems of intellectual property law and practice. The relationship between international trade, investment, and the treatment of culture. Technological convergence, that of course is a a huge subject in relation to the cultural industries. And we still see that more work is needed to ensure that the right legal tools are put in place. The arts and heritage and community development, a very obvious area in which much more work can be done. And finally, there's a need for much more joined up work that brings together in the cultural field governments, the industrial sector, the cultural industry sector, and civil society. And when I say governments, of course, I mean also at the city level, as many of us are already concerned about. And I think there needs to be, for such joined up work, some kind of how would I put it, a shared methodology, not a set of recipes, but a shared methodology, a range of incentives, and a relatively common lexicon, set of words and terms that we use that are understood across regions and across cultures. And that's why it seems to me that we really do need international comparative reviews of cultural policy practice, linking governments, research bodies, civil society actors, and their networks. We need, I think, permanent mechanisms at this level that do better than UNESCO and the regional organizations can. But for the moment, this is, if you like, a wish. It may be wishful thinking on my part, but I think that there is really the need to create some kind of systematic international comparative approach. And so I come now to what I think is the last bit of what I was going to share with you this afternoon. And that is, I think we do need to work even more than we have in the past on the work of civil society actors. What motivates civil society actors to carry out international cultural relations? What are the new connections and crossings that they are forging? Are there international communities of commitment and expertise emerging? What are the power relationships when you talk about international cooperation and you know where the money comes from? What are the power relationships in this universe? And what are all the imbalances and asymmetries that are still there? And how can we really make it possible for meaningful collaboration between between government and non-state actors to actually take place? And how much autonomy do governmental agencies afford civil society actors in shaping the pathways of international cultural relations? There was talk of this in the morning, and it seems to me that when we are faced with the official cultural diplomacy imperatives of governments, which are always in the interests of a particular government and its vision of the nation and its vision of itself, you have a bit of a mismatch there between what cultural players actually on the ground would like to do. And at a time when migratory flows are so huge, how are the ways in which civil society's cultural reference are being changed, being transformed? And then lastly, in terms of cultural relations that we often think of as being state to state or nation state container to nation state container, cities have become so very active. So what new patterns of cooperation are emerging as city authorities operate autonomously from nation states? And so we need to think about the forms of value that the pursuit of cultural relations actually brings to civil society actors. And a couple of years ago, there was some very interesting research that was done by the Open University and the Hertie School of Governments. And the research was called the Cultural Value Project, Cultural Relations in Countries in Transition. And of course, it was specifically applied to countries in transition. But some of the lessons that Helmut Anheier and his colleagues actually drew from that project seem to me really lessons and ideas that we must recognize for their usefulness. They mentioned mutual learning as one of the sets of values, together with space for joint reflection, debate, research, and experimentation. That last point, experimentation, is very important in order that there really can be active co-creation of new artistic work. The acquisition of new skills. But there we have to be careful because these kinds of flows from north to south may often bring with them approaches to training and education that may not be appropriate. They may be very good for European models and European countries, but not as elsewhere. Organizational capacity. When you have institutions working with institutions in other countries in an international logic, there is obviously going to be an increase in organizational capacity. There's obviously going to be the question of increased funding, but one of the issues is that these sorts of processes are long-term, and funders don't necessarily want to fund projects that are long-term. They want quick and dirty sort of projects that give results immediately. And of course, we can't forget that there are also negative dimensions in international cultural relations. But I'm not going to get into those today, because I think I would prefer to actually close and come back to these points if they actually interest you. And what I wanted to do just to close is to bring us back to another set of ideas that I believe this is the thinking of a British anthropologist called Adam Cooper, because everything that I've been saying about how we need to disaggregate, how we need to get away from the use of these grand abstractions has been put very well by Adam Cooper. And so I'm going to go into the screen share mode once again. And what I need to do is go to the next slide. And I can't find, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this. Okay, I'll stop sharing, and I don't really have a conclusion, but maybe we could use that as a conclusion. That if there's any kind of message that I can offer or advice I can offer, it would be to practice that kind of disaggregation, and that Adam Cooper just advised us to do. And I realize that I may not have spoken for 45 minutes, but I really preferred to have an interaction with you rather than continue. I did have a few more things I wanted to say, but I think the interaction will be more useful, certainly for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raj Isar. Yeah, as you promised in the beginning, some irritations and provocations. For the audience, please allow me to this remark that I stepped in with the moderation, so I'm in a way improvising, but it was a very thoughtful, inspirational second keynote, and I do have some questions, but as Raj Isar said, we would like to get also involved in the discussion with the audience. So my questions will be only serve as icebreakers. I thought, listening to you, that your keynote was very complementary in parts to the one we heard in the morning of Professor Xantakis, and in parts it was different. And we might come back to this, and probably, yeah, my idea for my questions is to bring out first a little bit more what might be different, because this will help us all and the conference to follow.
Odila, you're doing a great job. By the way, what's happened to Cesar?
We do not know yet. We do not know yet. So yeah, I'm really.
But it's great that you're there.
I know of my job since the beginning of the session. So, but I am inspired by your talk. So my first question is an easy one. And the question is what your explanations are that you didn't find an SDG component in cultural ministries, even in developing countries, if I understood you rightly. Then I have two more questions, which are a little bit more complex, but I thought this one is also very interesting in the beginning. So what are your ideas on this?
Well, it is true. Thank you, Odila. It is true that I wasn't able to find in the last couple of months that I've been thinking about this presentation, that there was a culture and sustainability component in the work of any nation state, but I can't vouch for that. It's not sort of exhaustive. So that's my answer on the first question. And what was the second question?
No, the second one was just a start as a warming up, an easy one.
Right.
So yeah, okay. The second one I will try to develop a little bit further. So as to my understanding, the SDGs, one of the core ideas is to actually bring about that the ecological, the economical, and the social sustainability cannot really be divided. That it's cannot be divided, and there are so many intersections and interferences, and the idea of this SDG is to bring this about. And for my understanding, or this is what I would like to bring into the discussion, supports actually the Terry Eagleton idea in the first part, meaning that it's also about the cultural factors that actually contributed to the ecological crisis. So why do you agree with this understanding? And if so, then why don't you see that there is an agenda in it, in the SDGs, and in this construction of bringing the social, economical, and ecological development, sustainable development idea together?
Well, because I think there is the element of core sustainability. So I'm a bit of a fundamentalist there, in that I really think that the term has its greatest value in terms of climate change and the environment. It's become a buzzword, as even Xantakis said this morning. It's part of a litany. It makes us feel good to be thinking that we're doing sustainable development. But what exactly is happening? What is economically sustainable development in relation to the cultural? Is it that economies are going to be run in such a way that the cultural industries sector and other institutions in culture are not in any way harmed by the development process? If it's in social terms, well, then we need to say, well, what is it that in social terms a government will define as contributing to convivencia, to the harmonious relationship between ethnic groups in a given society, and so on. So I know that there are in the agenda, there are many, many different elements, but there are just too many of them. That would be my for anybody to be able to tackle them.
Okay, and my next one before I join into the chat one is that I understood Professor Xantaki that she would answer participation is core. So you're asking, and I understand that this goes along with what you said right now, that in this was Adam Kuban calls disaggregation, you could be more specific, and that's why you could be probably more effective in your political action.
Right.
Right. But I understood Professor Xantaki, she said, if you look more from the people so far not within the power game, the participation as a political agenda is at the core and is the first step, because then people, they know themselves what's good for them and what for their communities sustainable. So why is participation not enough for a political agenda?
I don't think it's not enough. I think it's great that there be a political agenda that encourages participation. That's one of the core responsibilities for cultural policy. When you do have minorities, you do have groups that are marginalized and which don't have the means of expression, self-expression, and interaction. So there, absolutely, I don't disagree with that at all.
Okay, thank you so much. Then I would like to follow right now. Yeah, I start with a question from Carla Figuera. And she asked, could you please expand a little bit further on the cultural sustainable development concept? And I think, yeah, I go a little bit further with the other ones, but you mentioned several different ones.
Yes.
And one, you focused a little bit on Rossby's cultural sustainable development, but also you mentioned some others. And elaborate on this?
Crosby's work is very precise. And what I'm just doing, I'm leafing through my notes because I don't want to, just off the top of my head, do an injustice to the work of David Throsby, and for some reason, I found it. It happened to be just the last bit of paper, and here I found it. So what Throsby is trying to do with culturally sustainable development is draw a parallel between natural and cultural capital. He uses that notion of capital. And he says, while natural capital includes natural resources, ecosystems, and biodiversity, cultural capital is composed of cultural resources, cultural networks, cultural diversity. So ICRRA is a form, an avatar of cultural capital internationally. And then he spells out principles for cultural sustainability that mirror what can be specified already and has been for environmentally sustainable development. So he talks about intergenerational equity in cultural terms. And he says, well, what this means is that you have a situation in which development does not compromise the capacities open to future generations to access cultural resources and meet their cultural needs. So you're thinking about the future all the time. And this in turn would require a particular concern for protecting and enhancing a nation's tangible and intangible cultural capital, because it's the tangible and the intangible heritage that you are actually able to draw on this heritage and build for the future. And that leads him to intra-generational equity, so equity between the generations, which means within the same generation, sorry. Inter was the one that's from one to the other, and intra is within. It requires equity in access to cultural production, cultural participation, and cultural enjoyment to all members of the community on a fair and non-discriminatory basis. And this is always an issue. It's an issue. It could be an issue in industrially developed countries where there are pockets of poverty, not just in money terms, but in the cultural terms. It's certainly true across a number of developing countries that see themselves as homogeneous nation states with just one folk, one people, but in fact there are many. So that's the intra-generational aspect, where particular attention would need to be paid also to the poorest members of society to ensure that development is consistent with the objectives of poverty alleviation, that you're making the quality of life better even for the poor, and above all for the poor. And then cultural diversity, just as ecologically sustainable development requires the protection of biodiversity, so also, and that's the third principle that Throsby has articulated in his concept, so also we need to take into account the value of cultural diversity to economic, social, and cultural development. And I think he elaborated these ideas in a special issue of the International Journal of Cultural Policy that came out in 2015, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. I think I take also another question, because I think it seems to me that it's a good follow up to this one. In the disaggregation process, and also right now, and being more specific. So you asked also the question if international cultural relations are, as I understood, really very clear about their own power structures and where they're tied to. So we have, for example, the tensions between what is civil society, what is state, what are the intermediate borders and arm's length away, and so forth. So the question in the audience from Carla is then, if you understand it as learning communities, and you mentioned this especially for countries in transitions, do you have examples from the Aga Khan Foundation of good practice to be more clear about this kind of power structures and conditionalities in these international relations?
Well, I must confess that first I should explain that the Aga Khan system, it's a vast system which employs 80,000 people across the world. I repeat, 80,000. And it's called the Aga Khan Development Network. And one of the organizations within the system, within the network, is called the Aga Khan Foundation. And it's a little bit, you could think of it as a mini UNICEF. So it deals with social development, economic development. It doesn't deal with culture. And to be frank, or to be honest, I have so much work to do with my own organization, my own agency, which is different, and I'll come to that in a minute, that I haven't actually looked to see whether there's a recent publication, there must be, of the Aga Khan Foundation, which talks about its latest success stories. But it has reach that's very wide. Now, the organization that I now work for, the agency that I now work for since 2017, is called the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And it's not an agency that deals with the whole gamut of cultural practices. It was put together as an umbrella for 3 or 4 separate streams. The first of those streams of activity was the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which is a mechanism of recognition. If you like, it's the equivalent of the Pritzker Prize, but very much oriented to community development and service to local populations, improving the quality of life, and bringing in not just star architects for their beautiful buildings, but recognizing really good work that's solid and that is done with the help of engineers. So there are engineers who have actually won the Aga Khan Award. So there you have a mechanism of recognition. The second program of the trust is the Aga Khan Historic Cities Program, which is interventions of urban conservation in a number of cities across the Muslim world. Cairo, Lahore, in Afghanistan, Kabul and Herat, in India, Delhi, and so forth. A few more, I won't list them all. And there, the paramount objective is to say, we are not going in there just to preserve beautiful buildings. We are not just a conservation organization. It's very important for us to make sure that there is a local population that can benefit and that becomes a stakeholder whose life is made better by the fact that there is an Aga Khan Trust for Culture project there, a Historic Cities Program project there. And then you have a third program, which was launched just at the beginning of the 2000s, the Aga Khan Music Program, which works to preserve the musical traditions of countries in Central Asia, which went through the Soviet period in which the classical traditions, the high traditions of those different peoples were sort of shoved aside in favor of Western conservatory style training. And I have nothing against Western conservatory style training, but there's also the rest and many other people in those countries that preferred their own high traditions. And so the music program is doing that. But what it has found in its work is that there is such a lot of interest in this kind of thing that it's become truly intercultural. It's not just for Central Asia anymore. It works with North Africa, with Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's become a sort of major fixture on what you might call the world music scene. Then the fourth element in all of this is the Aga Khan Museum, which is located in Toronto, and which is based on a collection belonging to the Aga Khan family. And so the collection is not very big, but they are very, very energetically spreading through digital means of all kinds the message of, you know, what objects can tell us, what are the narratives, what are the stories that are built into objects that now sit in a museum. And the very last program to actually exist is the very small one that I run, which is on the objective of which is to see that the vast documentation, the resources of the trust are used in education by architecture schools, by secondary schools. There is experience there. The point is not to do propaganda for the work of the trust, but to say we can put at your disposal case studies of all kinds of issues, use them. And it's a win-win. If the schools like them, whether they're secondary schools or universities, then we're in business. So that basically, you know, coming back to the question I think that was there at the outset, which was, are there any lessons in the work of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture for cultural activism that deals with development? And the lessons are very much that you build in right from the start an ethic of improving the quality of life for the people, the local community, or the local communities.
Well, this was an extensive answer. Thank you very much. And the audience applauds and appreciates it. Then I would like to follow with a question on a little bit on a different kind of discussion strand. It's from Professor Okaka Dokoto. And he asks, when we come back to Terry Eggleston's quote, you projected.
Yes.
What it's a time while acknowledging its cultural significance to put it back in its place. The question is, what actually were the drivers? What put culture initially in the position, in the morbid and obsessional activity position, and what could bring it back?
Well, I don't think there's any clearly definable culprit. But basically, it's a long-term, deep-rooted trend that began, I would say, around the early 1950s, where the idea emerged that as part of political emancipation, and it actually first emerged from Africa, and many of the interesting international activities and causes, such as the restitution of cultural property, emerged from African concerns. And I have always been struck by a very, very close parallel between the kinds of thinking that were put forward at the end of the 18th century by Johann Gottfried Herder. And Herder's idea of Kultur and the German Romantics' idea of Kultur, which was a form of resistance to the idea of civilization that had taken root in the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. And as you know, Germany was not yet a nation. Being like the French and being like the British was kind of a value. And these thinkers, Herder was the first, there were several others who followed, they were very clear that what they were talking about didn't come in degrees. It wasn't that we have the best, we are the most advanced, we are civilized, the rest are savages. It was that there are different kinds of culture. So this idea of culture as a differential concept has been very long in the making, and there's an extraordinary parallel to be drawn between the German Romantic affirmations from the German bourgeoisie at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and the way in which the culture cause exploded in the mid-50s. It was the 60s, decolonization. It was civil rights in the United States and the affirmation of American blacks. So there have been a whole set of factors, of drivers who've contributed to this. And it was perfectly natural that in this climate, the champion, the organizational champion for this process should be UNESCO. And so these different concerns coalesced in the late 60s in UNESCO. They led to the first Mondiacult, which was in 1982. And ever since then, it's become, the cultural cause, if you like, has become a bandwagon, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. It has actually become completely internationalized, and it's very striking that wherever you go in the world now, there will be an awareness of our culture, our cultural identity, and that's very new. Just like the word identity, which was never used in this way before, as a marker of difference. If you think about identity in logic and philosophy, it was sameness, not difference. But now identity is difference.
Would you go that far that you think this also differentiates you from Professor Xantaxi's speech and concept?
No, I don't think it differentiates me, but I think there's a difference in that. The difference is that she, as a cultural rights scholar, is also a cultural rights activist, and she's unpacking and analyzing the issues around cultural rights, but that's her focus. My focus is much broader. I was trained in sociology and anthropology, and so what I'm really interested in is how concepts develop. It's there's a German discipline which is Begriffsgeschichte, and so that's what that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, which is why, and I'm not the only one. There are people in other parts of the world whose work I learn from and read, and we exchange notes, as it were, who look at discourse, who look at how people are talking about themselves and what are the main tropes, and so my way of looking at it is to say, I belong to this cause. I'm just as militant as any of you, but in my militancy, I try and be a little bit lucid about what's going on, and very aware. I say just the last thing, very aware of the power relationships, the power relations that underpin, let's say, national definitions of culture, local definitions of culture, that are they tend to exclude all the homogeneous definitions of what constitutes the cultural bag, as it were. Many of them can be very excluding rather than inclusive.
It seems to me that there are some more questions that focus now on the practical side or practical institutional side again a little bit. And so I would like to pick out one question from Charlotte Faucher and she asked, coming back to your impression that culture and sustainability you didn't find at the cultural ministries in developing countries, and she asked, so she would like to contrast this with the other part of her. Contrast it with her impression that many of the national cultural institutes, I think she pins out from Europe, put sustainable development in the focus. So how do you explain this strategy?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
The question isn't it striking the focus on sustainable development in British Council, Goethe Institute, and Institut Français is so strong? So how do you explain this?
Well, because everybody feels obliged to use these words. Just think of we're not living in a totalitarian system or authoritarian system, thank God, most of us. But just think of how in regimes where there is somebody who's telling you what to think. Well, there are no regimes that are telling us what to think in that way. But this is the way human beings in society actually work. We pick up ideas that seem to us to be mobilizing metaphors, and these mobilizing metaphors become bannerheads for our action. And this is great. We all need those kinds of things. But what I'm trying to say is that many of these defenses of sustainable development are very, very broad, and sometimes they're purely ritual. And so I'm not going to point a finger at any particular institution. I know that the ones you mentioned, the British Council does excellent work. The Goethe Institute does excellent work and thinks seriously about what it does, etc. IFA does excellent work. But my critique of the discourse is that it is just too broad and it doesn't always really know what it is talking about. And that I will be attacked on, but which is fine.
Okay, then I go with the next question. That is probably about, in an even broader sense, sustainability in international relations, because Sandra Montoya asked you if you have, could you elaborate on activities Aga Khan Trust does on the Latin American continent?
Well, the Aga Khan Trust is not a good example because its remit is to work across Muslim societies or societies where there are significant numbers of Muslims who are part of the local population, and with one very overriding principle that these activities are not they're certainly not for the Ismaili community of which His Highness the Aga Khan is the spiritual leader. It's not for them. It's not for his own people. He doesn't do philanthropy with his own people. It's not for the Muslim Ummah in general. It's for everybody. So the fact that great restoration projects are taking place from Cairo to Lahore, the most recent one is in Penang in Georgetown, which has Christian, Muslim, Hindu, and Chinese Shinto populations all combined in one place. The activities are carried out where there are significant numbers of Muslims who live, where there is a natural constituency, if you like, for that work. And so Latin America would automatically not figure in that program. The Aga Khan Trust for Culture doesn't see itself as an overarching international body that is wanting to give lessons to everybody across the world and is able to help and cooperate with everybody across the world. It just isn't. It's too small for that. Its whole annual budget is around $20 million. That's very, very little. So I hope that's clarified, the question of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And it would be the same thing with the Aga Khan Foundation. There may be socioeconomic activities of the Aga Khan Foundation in Latin America, but I tend to think that there aren't any. But that can easily be checked by the person who asked the question. You just do a Google search and you would be taken to the page of the Aga Khan Foundation.
To give the audience the chance to ask some more questions, I fill in with another one. And I would like to ask, you pointed out in the beginning very much that the concept of sustainability goes back to the Brundtland report and was very much focused on the ecological situation. And now, thinking about where we are right now in the year 2023, the ecological situation and climate crisis becomes very evident as very, very urgent. And at the same time, we are confronted with hegemonial shifts and a very polarized world that is also underpinned by quite an inequality also in the economic situations in the countries. So, is there a part of cultural policies, cultural relations to play in it, or is it not? And it should be part of this. This being more specific and doing what was called of this work to dismantle a little bit and put the strategies in focus.
That's a good question, and perhaps I went too fast over the section in which I was talking about the role of the arts, artists, cultural institutions. There's an enormous job of sensitizing people to these issues that can be done so much more powerfully by a painting, by a work of art, by a performance, even by a musical composition. And so I really believe that there is a very strong role for the arts practice. There's a very major role for the recognition of heritage, not the heritage itself, but the fact that we have a discourse and we have a practice that is oriented to using the resources of the past for some particular need in the present, and the need for the perpetuation of the built environment, of tangible and intangible heritage. That's part of what we are doing in the present for the future. So those are also cultural dimensions that are very important. But I think that beyond that, it's very difficult to see how the arts and heritage can contribute in even broader ways. And the whole problem, that, as I see it, is that the ways in which we're thinking about sustainable development are just simply too broad.
Yeah. So the next questions, they go in this the direction. So there was one from Kaya Ivar, the specific definition of sustainable cultural development. That would be so specific to foster the agenda, but I think you answered this right now. And then there's one more. On which level do you feel it is most productive to make a difference in international cultural relations for sustainable development? Is it the cities, or is it people to people, or is it has the state level lost its course, or is it civil? Yeah, I add to it, Carla, because I quote from Professor Xantaki, is a civil society actually to push the states?
Yeah. I would say that the key actors today are really civil society, cities, regions, non-central state institutions, where there are powerful central state institutions who are conducting cultural diplomacy. It's certainly advantageous for cultural actors, for arts actors, to join up with them to serve those causes. Because basically what they then have an opportunity, a platform to do is work with their peers in other countries to co-create. And that's the important element when there is co-creation. And sometimes you have to make certain kinds of decisions. For example, at the present time, the external cultural policy of my country of birth, India, is run by a government that is very much a Hindu chauvinist government. And it has preoccupations and concerns that make it prioritize and want civil society actors to project a certain kind of image of ancient India. But even before that, if you look at sort of neutral situations, and I can continue with India, where before the present regime, there was a Congress party regime which was very secular. The problem there was that governments always fall back on the familiar, the established, the traditionally consecrated, on the myths of the nation itself. And the result is that very little new work, experimental work, fusion work, work that's inspired by intercultural communication gets supported by those national programs. India has a body called the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, ICCR, that's always headed by an ambassadorial rank official in the foreign ministry. And the ways in which now, and for a long time, the ICCR has operated are not ideal from the point of view of cultural actors. And to a certain extent, you find the same kind of stereotypical presentation of what our culture is on the other side. I don't have the reference to hand, but there was a research done by two ladies that appeared in a volume a couple of years ago about cultural cooperation. I'm sorry, I don't remember the title. I remember the two authors, Amy Walker and Rusi Jhunjhunwala. Jhunjhunwala is a complicated name to remember. It's a Parsi name from India. And they looked at this very question, and they pointed out that the British Council offerings to the Indian viewing and listening public were also very stereotyped. There was very little original work that was being supported there. And what I have noticed, or noticed a decade ago when I was active in this field, I noticed that the Goethe Institute, for example, was much more imaginative. And that was the case in India. And I imagine that if it was the case in India, it would be the case elsewhere. That the Goethe Institute is less inclined to say that we are projecting the culture of Germany, but more to see what it is that would excite people on both sides and motivate them.
Great. I have a question from Gloria. I'm not right sure if I understand it right, but I take it like this. Do you have an example, an impression that sometimes the reducing carbon footprint is used as disguise for other interests of some international cultural relations practitioners?
I'm not aware. I'm sure that, you know, with any kind of good cause, there's always somebody who will be using it with an ulterior motive. So that this may be the case, but I'm just not aware of it. And perhaps as I didn't make clear enough at the outset, I really haven't followed the real detail of what's happening in the sustainable development arena as much as I might have done, because my other activities with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture keep me really very, very fully occupied. So this is a whole area that I've only just recently begun to revisit because of your conference. And I'm very glad I've done that. So I'll continue. So maybe I'll come up with the answer, but I don't have it now. Sorry.
Great. Then I think I would like to ask you a last question as a follow-up and a bridge to the next sessions of our conference. Because, I mean, you started that you were a little bit puzzled by reading the conference title, and then going through the concept, you changed your ideas. So, and you also indicated some research agendas you think that would be needed to be engaged with. So could you let us know in 2 or 1 sentences what you wish for the conference to discuss and find out?
Well, I think the themes that have been articulated already are excellent themes. So I'm going to be able to attend this afternoon, the next session. So I'm very interested in the themes that you're taking up in the next session, and also on Thursday. And I think what I could say is that in terms of outputs, I really hope that this conference actually leads to an international comparative cooperative research agenda. That would be, for me, the really ideal outcome of this conference. And that is what I would really wish for.
Thank you very much for being with us, for sharing your thoughts, engaging in the discussion, and giving this very meaningful intro speech. And thank you to the audience for being with us again. And as you have heard, we might see us in the afternoon, and we are here. There's still more we can be contacted. You find our contacts in the chat. Thank you very much for this session, and see you soon in the next session.
Well, thank you very much for having stepped in as moderator. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.